Hey guys, our friend Marshall Kosloff, he's going to be conducting interviews with experts and newsmakers for us here on the Breaking Points channel. We're really excited.
Yep, here it is.
Hey, Breaking Points. This is Marshall. I am joined by Charlotte Alter. She is a senior correspondent at Time, and we are talking about John Fetterman, the Democrats' nominee for Senate in Pennsylvania. He's a really interesting character who could say a bunch of things about Democratic strategy moving forward. We're also going to hit a bit about millennials and Gen Zs in politics. Lots of great things here. So, Charlotte, you've had some great pieces and Twitter threads on this. So let's start by introducing John Fetterman. Like, who is he and why does he seem to mean something bigger than just a typical Senate seat run?
Thanks, Marshall. Yeah, I mean, John Fetterman is somebody who has been really present in Pennsylvania politics for a while now, but I think a national audience just learned about him on Tuesday when he won the Democratic nomination for Senate. He is the lieutenant governor of Pennsylvania. Before that, he was the mayor of Braddock, Pennsylvania, which is a sort of a former steel town that's really been down in the dumps since since the steel industry and steel jobs left the area. And he is somebody who has kind of he's a real classic like Pennsylvania guy. Nobody is ever going to out Pennsylvania John Fetterman. He's 6'9". He doesn't really like wearing a suit. He normally wears a sweatshirt and shorts everywhere he goes, which political observers like me are like, mind blown. Oh my God. But voters seem to love it. I went to one of his events. I followed him around for a couple of days, a little bit before the primary. And I went to one of his events at a steelworkers union, and I counted, there were maybe like 30 people in the room, and I counted 5 guys there who had both his exact same outfit and his exact same haircut. So it's like he's clearly resonating with people, and you could tell because he won the primary by 30 points against Connor Lamb, who was the sort of who is a Pennsylvania congressman who was really endorsed by like most establishment Democrats. Joe Biden, he'd always had a sort of like Beau Biden vibe. And Connor Lamb really was kind of seen by a lot of Washington types as the type of like clean cut young up and comer who could win in Pennsylvania. And actually John Fetterman has really carved out a new and pretty strong path for Democrats there.
You know, it's interesting because there's 2 questions to the can he win in Pennsylvania thing. There's the can he win the Democratic primary or can he win the general election? So I think if you're a Democrat looking at the, let's say, probable bloodbath in the fall, if you're a DC type, you'd say, well, Connor Lamb is a great fit for that midterm. So how are people thinking about now that Fetterman's the nominee, how he's going to play in the general?
So one thing that I think people get wrong about John Fetterman, because there is this line of attack on him, people think that John Fetterman is like a Bernie Sanders progressive. And he's not. He did endorse Bernie Sanders in the 2016 campaign, but then he went on to campaign for Hillary Clinton, and he was not affiliated in the 2020 campaign, but he did campaign a lot for Joe Biden in the general. He's a get it done Democrat. You know, I asked him a lot of really pointed questions specifically about Bernie Sanders's sort of, or like the progressive politics that he's often accused of. I said, Medicare for all, yes or no? He's like, what is smart about him, I think, is that he's really working hard to not specifically align himself with one wing of the party, mostly because he knows that the voters don't really give a shit about that. So, for example, when I asked him about Medicare for all, if he had been a true Bernie Sanders style progressive, he would have been like, yes, Medicare for all or bust. Like, we have to have Medicare for all. Healthcare is a human right. All of the arguments that you've heard in support of this position. Instead, he's like, we need more healthcare. Any bill that comes through the Senate that would expand healthcare access in Pennsylvania, I will vote for. If that's a Medicare expansion, I'll vote for it. If it's Medicare for all, I'll vote for it. If it's Medicare for all who want it, I'll vote for it. If it's some kind of, way to expand Obamacare and it would be good for, expanding healthcare access in Pennsylvania, I'll vote for it. So that, I think people read that as a very kind of sane and practical way to look at this issue that actually Democrats spent 6 months arguing about 2 years ago. A Green New Deal, he's not for it. And that's interesting because, these people who are trying to attack him as if he is some kind of like progressive activist, he's actually there are only a couple issues on which he's pretty closely aligned with progressives on policy. And it's often the issues that Pennsylvania voters are especially enthusiastic about, like a $15 minimum wage, like strong support for unions, like getting rid of the filibuster to protect voting rights, things like that.
Okay, so then I was going to ask, what is he actually kind of more progressive on? You answer that then. Given what you said, though, why did he endorse Bernie in 2016?
I think that he sensed, and he's right, that Bernie was the populist candidate, and he's a populist guy. So I think the thing, and I've been talking with Fetterman now since 2018, really. Like I first got to know him shortly after Trump was elected. And he was one of the only people who saw that Trump was going to win Pennsylvania. I mean, the Clinton people were like, how much are we going to win by? Is it going to be 5 points or 18 points? And Fetterman was like, no, and so I think that he, just to be total honesty, I never actually, had a deep, long conversation with him about his thought process in 2016 when he made that endorsement. But I do know that he is definitely not a purist in the way that some people who, have been in the Bernie camp since 2016 are kind of purists about the Vermont senator's policy. In general, he's not a policy guy. And that is, I think, one of the reasons that he's been so successful in Pennsylvania and why he's really on track to win every county in Pennsylvania. Because I think he understands this really key thing, which is that when you go into these counties and you start talking to people don't come up to him and say, I only want Medicare for all, and I don't want any other healthcare option. People don't come up to him and say, Green New Deal or bust. People come up to him and say, instead, we need more healthcare. We need better paying jobs. And so he understands that a lot of these kind of questions of purity on policy proposals are a kind of Washington invention that ordinary voters, particularly in Pennsylvania, don't care that much about.
I'm glad you did all the substantive policy parts, because I do think we need to get to the shorts and the sweatshirt.
Yeah. Because
as you said in your recent piece in Time about him, he hates talking about this, but he's not here, obviously. So we'll get into it for a second. You had a tweet that I think speaks to this, which is you basically said, I think a lot of politicians are going to start putting away their suits and ties. So this question really relates to authenticity and how politicians think they should perform, because I think this speaks to Fetterman's skill set. The question that I think a lot of people are thinking of right now isn't, like you said, policy planks. It's trustworthiness. It's, is this a person who's likable? Like that specific dynamic. So how effective and widespread do you think we're going to see the, let's just transition to sweatpants and shorts take?
So I think the reason that this works for Fetterman is because this is what he has, a look that has been his look forever. If you look back at pictures of him when he was mayor of Braddock, it's the same exact look. I mean, he's very distinctive looking. He's extremely tall. He's extremely big. He's got a bald head. He's got a beard. And he's usually wearing, if it's not a sweatshirt, it's like a short sleeve button down or a t-shirt, or like it's not, he's very rarely in a suit, right? Mm-hmm. So I think if you took somebody who is out there wearing a suit all the time and said, just start showing up in sweatpants, then it would look kind of slobby or like inauthentic or kind of fake. And I think that that's the reason that he has been so successful, is that it's not like, oh, everyone can start wearing shorts and then they'll win statewide in Pennsylvania. That's not the takeaway. The takeaway is, if you are somebody who has, who is authentically connecting with people in your community, if you keep dressing that way, that authenticity will, in some ways, I think a lot of people read his refusal to start wearing a suit regularly as evidence that he is still connected with the people who first elected him. And I think in particular, I'll always remember we had lunch in 2018 at Netroots Nation, which is this like very progressive conference of progressive activists. And that was, shortly after Trump was elected, just ahead of the 2018 midterms. And at that point, the Democratic Party was basically like, we don't need white working class voters. They're too racist. White working class voters voted for Trump. We can get by without them. If we just turbocharge Black turnout and turbocharge youth turnout and really get all the women in the suburbs, we'll be able to win these elections. And so who needs those people? And John Fetterman was like, sure, maybe, but why would you want to find out? Mm-hmm. And I'll never, and his point, which I think is a really good one, which more Democrats should pay attention to, is he knows that he and the Democrats are never going to win white working class voters in Pennsylvania. They're never going to get 60% of white working class voters in Pennsylvania. They're not going to get 51% of white working class voters in Pennsylvania. But if they can get 20% or 30% instead of 10 or 15%, that's the difference between winning and losing in a state like Pennsylvania. So I think in some ways, the fact that he is this person with a level of authenticity that can reach some of the voters that feel like the Democratic Party isn't even trying to talk to them, his strategy and his hope is that is going to help lift him over the top statewide in November.
I think the last question speaks to your broader work, totally unrelated to Fetterman, especially because of age. You wrote a book a few years back that I really enjoyed. Saagar and I did a realignment episode about it, and it's called "The Ones We've Been Waiting For: Millennials, Young People, and Politics." Yeah, right there in the back. Weird time I think the book was very optimistic. And I feel as if every year since the book came out, you've been a little less optimistic. And I think Madison Cawthorn losing, a few nights ago, I think Elise Stefanik, who's in no danger of losing, regardless of how you, to our bipartisan audience here, regardless of how you think about her rhetoric, those bits, she's not going to transcend anything. She is a hyper partisan person for good or for ill. And a lot of the promise of, I think, the interviews you had with her back in 2020 were to this idea of, I'm this millennial, I have these ambitions, but they're going to be transcendent. So can you just give us the epitaph, the latest Charlotte update on whether we should be optimistic about younger people making a difference in the system?
Yeah, I'm really glad that you mentioned Elise Stefanik, because she's somebody, here's the thing. What is always a risk that you run when you write a book about people who are at the beginning of their careers, like I did, is that things change. There's a reason that most people write biographies once the person's kind of retired. And my book isn't a biography, by the way. It's sort of like a snapshot in time. But what's interesting is when the book first came out, Stefanik was very, in all of my interviews with her for the book, she was kind of held up as an example of a young Republican who was, very conservative, but also working to try to find some kind of bipartisan way forward on some of the issues that millennials really care about, like immigration, like climate change, and college affordability. And literally, in the span of time in between when the book came out and then when the paperback came out, she morphed herself into an ultra MAGA type Republican, and she really lashed herself to Donald Trump. So there's really a whole chapter in the book about how earlier in her career, she was kind of like tiptoeing around Trump and not really embracing him, but also not really denouncing him, and just sort of trying to like twirl on the tightrope a little bit. And so the paperback is significantly updated to reflect a lot of the way she's changed. But the thing to remember, I think, particularly about Stefanik, is that she's incredibly smart, she's incredibly ambitious, and she's a Republican in New York State. So that means, why does that matter? It means that she's not going to be in the Senate from New York, and she's not going to be governor of New York, because it's just such a deep blue state. I mean, it would be very, very difficult, a big long shot for a Republican to win statewide in a state this blue. So she knows that her ladder upwards in American politics is through the House of Representatives. And so it seems obvious to me as an observer and somebody who watches her closely and talks to a lot of people who are and have been close to her, is that the calculation she made is that in order to advance within the Republican Party circa 2020, 2021, 2022, you have to be a Trump Republican. And listen, that bet paid off. She is now the highest ranking Republican woman in America. She is the highest ranking millennial in Congress. She's got a straight, if she is in congressional leadership, I think it would be a mistake to bet against her as the first Republican woman Speaker of the House. So I just think for her, the bet paid off. I also think, you asked about optimism. I am, one of the things that I find interesting is that almost all of the people in my book are still active in politics right now. So I had kind of expected that some of them would have fallen off or lost re-election. I mean, Max Rose lost re-election, but he's running again, so he might be back in Congress. But I do think that I am still optimistic in the long run. I think we've got a pretty thorny couple of years ahead, particularly when it comes to democracy. But if you were to, if somebody were to ask me to bet whether American democracy would still exist in its current form 15 years from now, I would say yes. It's kind of depressing that that's even a question, though.
Yeah, and I think the note just to end on is, I think the takeaway from, once again, Cawthorn and Stefanik, regardless of what you think about their actual politics, and insert AOC here too, electing young people is not just going to in of itself address that problem, because you just see a lot of this rhetoric, especially with the people who watch shows like Breaking Points, who say like, man, like the problem in our politics is that Nancy Pelosi is old, Chuck Schumer is old, Biden's old, Trump's old. There's lots of older people here. And so far, track record wise, electing younger people, if there's a tipping point, it's nowhere near there. So I think it's just important to be clear-eyed about those structural problems that you really get into in the book and comes through in your writing.
Yeah, no, I think you're completely right. And one thing I always feel that I have to clarify is, the argument of my book is not that young people will save us. The argument of the book is that this generational shift, which is coming partly because your listeners are right that our existing government is so old, that this coming generational shift is going to usher in a new type of political paradigm. And I'm not necessarily saying that's good. More Madison Cawthorns in Congress is not good. So I think that there are some areas in which it could be good. I think, for example, utter climate denialism is probably going to be on its way out when this new generation takes over. But I also think that Trumpism has so thoroughly infiltrated our politics, particularly on the right, that I think Trumpism is a stronger force than generational change. And both things are happening at the same time. So they kind of like play off each other. And certainly in 2018, they did play off each other a lot. And I think too in 2020. But I'm still, 2022 and 2024, I am still, it's still unfolding. And I think that people who come through with really strong predictions about what's going to happen. I mean, listen, obviously Republicans are favored to win the midterms this year. I'm not denying that. But I also think there's a lot that we don't know about how these elections are going to play out, particularly, Trump's had a kind of spotty track record with his endorsements, which I think is a surprise to a lot of people. So yeah, I just think we have to wait and see.
Very well said, Charlotte. Thank you so much for joining us on Breaking Points.
Thank you so much for having me, Marshall. Great to talk with you.
Cable news is ripping us apart, dividing the country, making it impossible to function as a society, and making it impossible to know just what is true and what is false. But the good news is they are failing and they know it.
That is why we're building something new, a new mainstream, a healthier one, something more trustworthy, something that we are going to need in one of the most pivotal times in American history. We are building up here for the midterms, for the upcoming presidential election, but we need your help. So if you can help us out by becoming a premium member today at breakingpoints.com, we're trying to change America for the better and the entire world.
So what are you waiting for, guys? Go to breakingpoints.com and sign up and help us build a new mainstream.